Do you know of any instances where a non-Western nation has placed sanctions on a Western nation? This has never occurred, though, because the West has always employed sanctions as a weapon against nations who seek to end its hegemony. Additionally, those restrictions do not protect African nations. Uganda, Niger, Gabon, and the Central African Republic were recently excluded from the US-led African Growth and Opportunity Act due to sanctions imposed by the West. As anticipated, the West levied penalties to penalize these African nations for their decision to act independently of Western directives. The question of why African nations do not apply sanctions on Western nations arises at that point. Africa has 54 countries, whereas the Western side has 52, including the US, Canada, and Europe. What if every African country applied one of the strictest sanctions on the West? Watch this video to see how accurate the timing of the sanctions imposed by Africa is. In reaction to Uganda's enactment of an anti-LGBTQ bill, the United States imposed sanctions in June of this year, including limiting visas for Uganda officials. At the same time, the European Union banned the military junta behind the Niger coup from traveling. It has established a habit for Western powers, especially the United States and European states, to use such punitive measures repeatedly in an attempt to influence African governments. And this has become a habit in the West. The West will band together and apply sanctions on any country in the world whose policies it disagrees with. The targeted nation will be offered two choices: either reverse its actions or face penalties. Sanctions are not so much a legal measure in the international arena as they are a form of blackmail. The international community does not oppose, though, because Western nations participate in it. In spite of allegations of human rights abuses against Western countries in Africa and around the world, no African government or organization has ever retaliated by putting sanctions on a Western country. According to some, African nations may be seen as being too weak to engage in such activities. However, another viewpoint contends that given the potential repercussions of African countries imposing sanctions on the West, it may be time for African countries to re-evaluate this restraint. History demonstrates that in order to increase the effectiveness of the sanctions, the African states never banded together against any Western nation. And it is an issue. For the first time in history, African nations are being urged to consider deeper ties and enacting sanctions against the West. When powerful nations believe a smaller nation is breaking international law, they impose sanctions on it as a form of punishment. Nevertheless, no such transgression of international law exists. Rather, sanctions are imposed because some nations, despite their weakness and small size, frequently choose not to comply with Western directives. As a result, sanctions are put in place to penalize people and undo their choices. Powerful countries, especially those possessing nuclear weapons, frequently use this aggressive tactic to persuade weaker countries to agree with them. Although sanctions can be applied by any nation in theory, larger and more powerful countries tend to utilize this tactic more frequently. The United Nations Security Council's 5 notable members, and the USA, have unique authority known as veto power, and they frequently employ penalties to further their own agendas. Unfortunately, this strategy doesn't always take into account the wishes of weaker and smaller countries, and these 5 countries' veto power can make it more difficult to achieve world peace. When combined with the use of sanctions, the veto power of the UN Security Council, which is often condemned for being undemocratic, makes it difficult for regions like Africa, the Middle East, the Far East, and the Caribbean islands to achieve durable peace. Africa is the region most affected by sanctions, whether they are imposed by international organizations like the European Union or the UN Security Council, or by individual nations like the US or France. Peace and security are frequently mentioned as the motivation for these measures. But it raises the question of how measures that negatively affect a nation's economy and the lives of its population, such freezing a country's money or halting trade agreements, actually helped to achieve peace and security. This strategy appears contradictory since, rather than addressing the underlying problems that led to the implementation of penalties, the actions done have broad effects on the entire population. In 2009, for example, the United Nations Security Council imposed sanctions on Eritrea, including stopping the sale of weapons to the country and cutting off aid and military training, after accusing it of supporting terrorist organizations in Somalia and being involved in a conflict with Djibouti. After years of suffering under these harsh sanctions, it was ultimately discovered that there was no proof linking Eritrea to terrorist organizations. Additional sanctions were issued by the UN Security Council in 2011. This time, it involves financial measures like changing mining exploration techniques and withholding 2% of taxes brought home by Eritreans living overseas. Eritreans around the world fought for the lifting of these sanctions, contacting all 15 Security Council members by letters, emails, and pleas. Few members replied favorably in spite of their attempts. In 2018, the UN Security Council ultimately withdrew sanctions based on unverified assertions after 10 years of struggle. Yes, Eritrea was subjected to sanctions for 10 years for nothing at all. That's how international law administers punishment. The 10 years were sufficient to completely destroy Eritrea's economy, even if those restrictions were removed. That's exactly what the West desired. Why don't we hear about France or the United States being treated similarly? Why haven't they been accidentally sanctioned for 10 years? That's because it's they that employ penalties as a form of blackmail. The issue is that African countries who oppose the West are currently subject to sanctions imposed by the West through African organizations. ECOWAS and similar organizations become into Western tools, potentially enabling outside countries to meddle in the affairs of the continent. As demonstrated in the case of Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, this meddling has resulted in sanctions and even military actions. Currently, the African Union and regional economic blocs have imposed sanctions on violating governments, mostly by suspending their membership in reaction to the increase in coups since 2019. The African Union suspended the membership of Sudan, Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Niger, and most recently, Gabon between June 2019 and August 2023. Regional blocs in West and Central Africa also took similar actions against Burkina Faso, Gabon, Guinea, and Mali. The Economic Community of West African States imposed economic sanctions on the offending states in 67% of recent coups. That is the clearest evidence that Western governments typically use African organizations as a means of punishing African nations. However, the good news is that the third wave of coups that is currently occurring. One noteworthy trend is that repeated overthrows in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Sudan were not stopped by sanctions. However, African organizations are currently defying pressure from Western nations. The AU was hesitant to take action against Niger, but Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Gabon were immediately suspended. The AU took independent action in Chad, citing security concerns rather than interpreting the situation as an unlawful change of government. ECOWAS is currently the lapdog of choice in the West. All of the coup nations in the region are subject to administrative and economic sanctions. However, the activities of neighboring countries reduced their effectiveness. Certain states in Mali voiced their concerns on the sanctions and improved collaboration with the de facto government of the nation. Critics question whether African institutions are effective in protecting the interests of the continent because they may inadvertently allow outside intervention by enforcing sanctions and allowing military interventions. The story calls for a reconsideration of the function of African organizations, emphasizing the need to gauge how well they contribute to peace and stability. African countries are more vulnerable to outside intervention as a result of the activities of the African Union and regional blocs such as ECOWAS. The European Union and other European nations would have no need to meddle in African issues at will if these institutions were successful in carrying out their mandates. It's incredible that the African Union and ECOWAS continue to look to the West for support and approval amid African crises, despite the detrimental effects of Western meddling. The situation in Libya demonstrates the disastrous effects of such interventions. These findings raise the possibility that the African Union and ECOWAS are being used as instruments of Western objectives, using sanctions as a weapon rather than going to war with countries that refuse to back down. Western-backed African leaders frequently avoid sanctions, despite claims of suffering and corruption. On the other hand, leaders who oppose particular agendas are subject to a variety of penalties. In general, there is a desire for Africa to declare its independence and re-evaluate its relationship with the West. If African organizations continue to be used as instruments and toys for Western objectives, their legitimacy is called into question. Africa must be resilient in the face of outside pressure and embrace a more independent approach to development and governance. Africa, which has long been subjected to Western meddling, is now being pressured to change this dynamic. Sanctioning former colonial powers for their past actions, enforcing reciprocal sanctions on nations that impose unfair sanctions on Africa, holding those responsible for the assassinations of African leaders accountable through sanctions, and enforcing sanctions on countries that contribute to destabilization in African nations are all part of the suggested strategy. Sanctions should also be applied to the West for their exploitation of African minerals. Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's proceed. The proposed proposals advocate a radical change in diplomatic relations, going beyond economic measures. In order to lessen its reliance on the West, Africa is urged to look into alternative alliances with states like China, Russia, and other Asian countries. Travel bans that are reciprocated and the expulsion of businesses that pollute the environment and exploit African resources are among the proposals. The main objective is for Africa to become less dependent on the West and more independent and self-sufficient. The goal is to industrialize Africa without interference or exploitation from outside forces. This shift calls for a brave reevaluation of Africa's relationship with the West, with a focus on self-determination and fortitude. In an effort to change the security dynamics of the continent, there is also a call for the demolition of Western military sites, particularly those that the US and France use for spying in Africa. In actuality, however, the sanctions that the West placed on Africa had some unanticipated positive effects. The West believed that it could continue to influence Africa while imposing sanctions on it. Now, however, things are different. The prospect of fresh US sanctions against African countries seems to be pushing them away from American influence and toward a new, East Plan global order. The erroneous beliefs of politicians like Joe Biden will probably be a key factor in historians' analyses of the conflict between the West and Russia. They underestimated the complexity of the situation and continue to believe that the Ukrainian army, with their help, could defeat the Russians quickly. Furthermore, expecting cooperation with the sanctions and perceived hegemony of London and Washington. These Western leaders exaggerated the power they thought their old colonial colonies in Africa possessed. These erroneous assumptions could be described as delusional by historians. A new international order and a radical reset are made possible by this illusory thinking, which also pushes Western nations into economic difficulties like the post-war era, which included food shortages and skyrocketing prices in the UK. Sanctions are the first step in this change. The efficiency of stronger secondary sanctions is yet unknown, despite historical evidence showing that penalties frequently fail to meet their goals. By limiting their trade with a common enemy, these sanctions attack allies. The Biden administration has recently issued warnings to African countries that believe the purchase of oil from Russia may have gone unnoticed by the mainstream media. However, if these threats are carried out, it would be a grave historical mistake that could mark the end of US hegemony as it is currently understood. Russia recently allowed grain cargoes to leave the port of Odessa, thanks to Turkey, alleviating a crisis that many African and Middle Eastern nations were facing as they teetered on the brink of a food shortage. It is impossible to overstate the consequences of a country in these areas being unable to manufacture and market subsidized bread. In the past, such circumstances have sparked uprisings, boosted support for terrorist organizations, and an increase in the number of people escaping to join migrant caravans bound for Europe. To his credit, Putin quickly approved the agreement in response to pressure from other nations to take action. As seen, superpowers take the big picture into account. In particular, Europe is eternally grateful to Putin and President Erdogan for averting a possible food crisis brought on by the region's wheat shortages. But there isn't any appreciation or goodwill, which would have provided the groundwork for taking these discussions further. Additionally, when in Accra, Ghana, we saw US Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, issue a fairly direct threat to any African nationalism considering buying Russian oil. America and the West as a whole seem to have overplayed their hand. The West will bear the brunt of the consequences. Once more, the West itself will suffer as a result of Biden's miscalculation. It's a recurrent subject that keeps coming up. African nations may be able to lift these restrictions. Seldom is it mentioned that Biden did not enforce the secondary sanctions that the Trump administration imposed on China, India, and a few other countries to stop them from purchasing Iranian oil. Enforcing them could be difficult. Minerals and precious metals that are essential for Western-made gadgets like iPhones may encounter obstacles from African nations prepared to resist Washington's irrational, if not outmoded, intimidation. Lithium-ion battery manufacturing uses cobalt, which may also be at the core of a sanctions dispute. The governments of the nations that extract it might sell exclusively to the East and profit handsomely from such a geopolitical move if they are subject to sanctions. Longer term, however, is where Biden's most recent blunder poses a greater concern. At a pivotal UN vote in February, 20 African nations declined to denounce Russia's invasion of Ukraine. These leaders intend to remain non-aligned in a new Cold War that is developing as a result of the West's erroneous policies that demonize Putin. As China, Russia, and India develop closer commercial and geomilitary links, and the East begins to take control, these nations want to avoid getting involved in a conflict they feel is not theirs and keep trade choices available to all sides. Some of these nations may decide to leave their comfort zone of non-alignment and join the new global order being fashioned by the East as a result of the increasing threats of US sanctions. This would not be a significant leap of faith because China is currently Africa's largest investor. French troops have been leaving Mali in recent days to be replaced by Russian mercenaries and brand new planes that Putin donated. Uganda, Gabon, Niger, and the Central African Republic will not be included in the special US-Africa trade program, according to President Joe Biden's current intentions. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, which was created in 2000, will not apply to these countries if they are alleged to have committed egregious human rights violations or to have not made sufficient progress toward democratic administration. President Biden explained that because of their lack of progress in building democratic pluralism and the rule of law, Niger and Gabon, which are currently governed by the military as a result of coups this year, are not eligible for AGOA. The decision comes after the US government considered pulling Uganda out of AGOA in May after the country passed a contentious anti-homosexuality law that makes some same-sex offenses punishable by death. African countries may look into ways to reverse these sanctions as a result of President Biden's decision, which might increase tensions. The ramifications of this action, along with possible disputes over oil purchases, highlight the possibility of a serious error in judgment that might have an impact on the US and the impacted countries. The geopolitical environment is also affected, with the potential for alliances changing as African nations contemplate joining the East-shaped New World Order. Such a shift is conceivable given China's significant investments in Africa, and recent developments, like the French forces' withdrawal from Mali and their replacement by Russian mercenaries, highlight the region's changing dynamics. Additionally, in a new Cold War scenario, when non-aligned nations prefer to maintain open trade options and reject taking sides, President Biden's decision may have an impact on the long-term alignment of African nations. With China, Russia, and India fortifying their trade and geopolitical links, this action might unintentionally add to the East's expanding might. African countries ought to band together at that point and put sanctions on the West in retaliation. Because of the historical disproportionate influence that Western nations, especially former colonial powers, have had over African countries, sanctions are sometimes perceived as punitive measures that have an impact on African economies and political stability. African countries can express their independence, level the playing field, and protest unfair treatment by Western countries by enforcing reciprocal sanctions. In an effort to promote discussion, negotiation, and a more fair settlement of conflicts, Western nations are deterred from enforcing unjust sanctions by the prospect of reciprocal penalties. In order to strengthen Africa's negotiating power internationally, proponents stress the need for African solidarity in enforcing sanctions. They argue that the continent would be better able to defend its interests with this united front. Proponents contend that placing sanctions on Western nations would challenge the idea that only strong states have the authority to employ sanctions as a foreign policy instrument and highlight what they see as unfair practices in international politics. Then, in reaction to penalties against African countries, 54 African countries together imposed sanctions on 50 European states, the United States, and Canada. This is a power contrast. African countries would need to carry out a thorough analysis of the possible economic effects on both sides, comprehending the ramifications for both their own economies and the targeted Western countries, prior to enacting reciprocal penalties. Alliances with governments that share similar concerns about perceived unfair sanctions and global power imbalances would probably be sought, and gaining support from areas and countries outside of Africa would be essential. Given that Russia and China support Africa, sanctions on the West can have significantly more beneficial effects. To withstand possible effects of targeted Western sanctions, African countries would need to strengthen their economic resilience, diversify their trading partners, and create strong economic plans. And after siding with Russia and China, this has already been accomplished. African countries have a variety of instruments at their disposal to counter the West in the context of economic responses. Trade retaliation is one such tactic. It focuses on particular industries or products that are essential to Western businesses in order to restrict trade in a targeted manner. This might entail actions like restricting the export of cobalt, which is necessary for the manufacturing of batteries in the West, or reducing the sales of diamonds, which fuel luxury markets. Control over strategic resources by African countries increases the efficacy of this strategy. The financial squeeze is an additional option that involves measures including restricting diplomatic assets, or taking money out of Western institutions in order to send a strong statement and cause financial instability. Limiting visas or prohibiting travel for Western officials and corporate executives is another tactic that can sabotage diplomatic relations and have an impact on global economics. Apart from economic tactics, African countries might also consider other options, such as using the collective voice. By using organizations like the African Union to denounce Western sanctions, African nations can potentially gain international support and apply diplomatic pressure. This may entail making powerful speeches, stressing how sanctions hinder African growth and promoting more equitable trade policies. Do you believe that African nations ought to band together and punish the West with the most severe sanctions? What would happen if Africa as a whole chose to stand up, turn against the West, and tie with China and Russia? Do you think Africans are that united to sanction the West? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. We explore the rich history, culture, and the ongoing struggle for sovereignty in Africa. Join us in this important conversation by subscribing to our channel. By subscribing, you're not just staying informed, you're becoming part of a movement dedicated to reclaiming Africa's rightful place on the global stage. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let's work together to spread knowledge and inspire change. Thanks for watching.